Good afternoon. All right, we're all here. Welcome to the afternoon session on South by Southwest. My name is Jeff. Look forward to sharing some ideas with you this afternoon. Over the last 150,000 years, human development has been fairly local and linear. From agrarian to even the last couple hundred years only, we've seen the changes, the first, second, third, and now the fourth industrial revolution. There's a lot of angst these days, though, because we're at the cusp of something different. It's more global, and it's more exponential. And study after study has shown that people have this sense of anxiety about this. Things have changed before. New worlds were discovered, or new countries and lands, but there's a perceived pace of change. And a perceived pace that my learning, what I'm doing, isn't going to be enough. And so what does this exponential change look like anyway? If you think about growth, either your own personal growth or the growth of your company over time, we've all been brought up to think, well, linear is pretty good. Continuous improvement. You improve a little bit each year. Companies certainly think that way, right? 5% profits every year. The trouble is, with new technology, with these disruptive forces, things have gone nonlinear. The Netflix versus Blockbuster is very popular, but it's also against the cable, and now Netflix is winning Academy Awards. So you've got a lot of disruptors that might appear to be small competitors that by the time you catch up or realize, you're being left behind, and that causes the angst. So what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about what are some things you can do on a personal level to maybe equip yourself and not be maybe anxious about the future, but actually excited about it. Now you might think, well, maybe if you're in Silicon Valley, you're in New York, Beltway, that's kind of a hotbed, or maybe that's where all these skills are. And I can tell you that I was nowhere near any of those places. This is a farm in southwestern Indiana. That's where I grew up. It's my farm. You couldn't get any farther away from those places. And so I did what I thought you were supposed to do. Went to college, got an engineering degree, worked in manufacturing, and after a few years, got married, child, and you know what? Started to realize there's a lot that I didn't know. I didn't know what I didn't know. And so I became very curious, and over the years, trying to get a set of skills. I got the consulting bug, got into consulting, and worked with some fantastic and very intelligent people, learning along the way. Our own consulting practice, hired a couple hundred people, built a practice, worked with the very best in the world, universities, consultancies, senior executives, and over a period of time, put together a toolkit that was practical. And I mention that because there's a lot that you can get that looks good in theory, but doesn't hold up in the real world. And so after 20 years of doing this, became associated with the University of Texas at Dallas. And they were struggling. The University of Texas had some fantastic graduates, but they're very quantitative, especially in the marketing program. They said, how can we have better storytellers? How can we develop better insights? So I actually developed a curriculum for them, a course I teach up there, and this is essentially what we have there. After teaching the course for a few semesters, realized there wasn't a good textbook on the market that actually showed or shared these skills. So I actually took some time, nights and weekends, and built a book, or wrote a book. And this is more or less what came from it, what we use in the class as a textbook. The foundation of skills, I believe, is learnability. It's learning how to learn. Think about that. Whenever you're taught, you learn the content and maybe you apply it. Did you ever actually in school learn how to learn? The speed of learning, the depth of retention is one of the most important things possible, and yet we aren't taught that. The next level in this emerging pyramid are these foundational competencies: critical thinking, creative thinking, oral communication, written communication, productivity, leadership, and also analytical frameworks and estimation, these real consultative skills. These are skills that, over the course of time, they were important 30 years ago, they're important today, they'll be important decades from now. The next level are what I'm calling evolving competencies. These are the ones that, they're not brand new, but they're emerging. We don't really know where they're going to go, what the maturity is going to be. Design thinking, agile, project-based thinking, artificial intelligence, AI, and I would also put in there data visualization and analytics. These are things that are so-called digital skills and are important to acquire and master. So let's look at these. Critical thinking sounds kind of boring, doesn't it? Like maybe it's something from oratory or the Greeks of 2,000 years ago. Maybe that's back before computers. Fact is, it is literally how to think. And this is a model that I've developed or I've used and adopted. First of all, you question. Notice what's going on. What do you know? What are you assuming? What questions can you ask? Can you clarify? What does data mean? And also, in a rush for big data, what about thick data? What about the human element, the empathy, understanding how the actual customers work? And then something that's missing today a lot is evidence, support. What evidence do you have? What data should you use? What's the secondary research? Then the analysis or evaluation. Hopefully you take a hypothesis up front, like you take a stand on something, and then you prove or disprove it. And then how can you reduce and refine and lean out the answer? And finally, how can you structure the logic? And then take a step back and say, what did I learn? How can I improve? What perspective did I gain? That is critical thinking in a nutshell. There are probably 20 or 30 sessions here at South by Southwest on storytelling, which is very important. I would also say, though, that without substance, the story is a wrapper around something that's empty. So you need both. If you think about communication, it isn't how much information you can throw in the other direction, check the box and say, I've communicated. Imagine there's a pipe of comprehension between you and the recipient. The breadth of that pipe is comprehension. Imagine trying to communicate through a straw. Even if you have your message right, it's painful and impatient to get there. So the idea is removing all the obstacles for that communication. And the idea also is that you take some work to make the message for the benefit of your audience. It's actually an attitude of service. You're not trying to dispute information. You're trying to craft it so someone can learn from it. They can adopt it. And people appreciate that. Even if you're selling, even if you're in a negotiating context, they appreciate the extra work. So think about a pipe of comprehension. And by the way, that's why senior executives pay management consultants a lot of money, because they can get this comprehension in 10, 15 minutes, whereas their staff might take hours to get them, or weeks. The David is one of the most iconic and beautiful works of Western art. Michelangelo created this big chunk of marble. And people asked him, how could you craft this? He said, the David was always in there. I had to remove everything that wasn't the David, and it emerged. In some respects, your message is like that. You're all subject matter experts in your field, and yet, your David is in there somewhere. But by communicating more effectively, stripping away jargon, leaning out communication, prepositional phrases, active tense, all these things that appear to be tedious actually improves that pipe of comprehension. One other thing that's noteworthy about this is originally this was commissioned. If you've ever seen a cathedral in Western Europe, you notice how they have tiers of these statues? This was going to be in the third tier, off in the corner. He decided he would make something so good they couldn't ignore it. Have you heard that phrase before? Be so good they can't ignore you? He decided it was so good, and the folks in charge of the cathedral just couldn't bring themselves to put it up there in that third tier, and they brought it down. So think about those few works that you have that you put everything into. The worst that will happen is you will master your topic, and who knows, especially in this very connected world, that blog post you write, that report you write, someone down the road will see that, and your excellence will come out. An interesting complement to communication and speaking is listening, active listening. You know when someone's listening to you. It feels like a warm blanket. It feels like you're being heard. And also, rather than just waiting for someone to take a breath and jump in, which I'm sure we've all had that in these conference calls, you actually learn. You learn what they're about and can tailor your message. It's not just for oral communication. The flip side of writing is reading, active reading, and being able to deeply notice what you're reading and comprehend it. We gloss over way too many things. How many of you have an Audible account and set your speed to 1.5 so you can listen to more books? Or maybe reduce the pauses. That's good for news and things that are kind of consumable. But what about things you really want to learn? Those pauses were there for a reason for the speaker. So it's interesting about volume versus comprehension. And finally, think about channels of communication. There are words in verbal. Dr. Morabian, several decades ago, conducted a test on verbal communication, and he found that 7% were the words. Now, there were some nuances to the study, like it was only with women, only in certain situations, but the fact remains, much of our message is beyond the words. There's vocalics, which is the pitch of what we're saying, ending your sentences high or low. Chronemics, if you have a pause, it's the pace of what you're saying. Kinesics, body language, making the point and the emphasis. Proxemics, how deep you are or how close you are making a point. And finally, haptics with touch. Maybe there's a prototype, business card, handshake. The point isn't to get confused or overthink these things, but just know these are the channels you have. And if you only focus on the words, you miss most of the message. Also, if you're on a conference call, for example, you have to rely on words, chronemics, and the intonation because you don't have the body language or you don't have the visual. If you really want to learn something, teach. It sounds trite, but think about it. You have to learn, you have to intake, you have to relate it to your own background, and then you have to relate it to the person you're with, you're communicating to. And if you really want to, then write it down. You have to organize your thoughts. That's how you really master something. And it has the added benefit of getting your word out there. Well, we talked about thinking and communicating, but how do you bridge these things? That's the question, that's the challenge that Mackenzie put forward to Barbara Mento in the 70s when she was responsible for all these young folks coming out of college. Smart, but how would they be worthy of working with senior executives? This thing called the pyramid principle emerged. You start with a situation. What's the context? What's the background? Something we all would agree on. It's a starting point, rather than starting with something we disagree with. A complicating factor. Intentionally create some tension. We want to grow, and yet commodity prices have changed. Competition is different. And then there's an implicit question that comes up. What do we do? Instead of burying the answer in the back, bring the answer forward. Here's what we do. And then you support it with 3 points, maybe 5 points, somewhere in between. These need to be mutually exclusive, so they don't overlap, and collectively exhaustive, so they more or less cover the range of options. And then you support them. Any good report you read, any presentation, it's designed this way, whether you realize it or not. And every report that you do, whether it's a PowerPoint presentation or whether it's just normal writing, the more that you think like this, you will bridge the gap. This is important. You think deductively, you think in terms of scientific method, but you communicate inductively. You're rearranging it. No one needs to go through all your steps. Maybe your teacher did back in school, and it's a habit that stays with us. Think deductively, communicate inductively. Now, frameworks are great things. They're models. You can stand on the shoulders of giants. There are hundreds of them. The BCG Growth Share Matrix, the periodic table is a framework. Covey, there are hundreds of them. This is half of one page on the web. And go for it. You can learn all these frameworks, but really there are 3 that cover the vast majority of what you need on a day-to-day basis. First of all, it's when you need to select something. You're making a choice. Like maybe you're buying a vehicle. Do you want a sports car? Do you want a pickup truck to haul things? Do you want like a Prius for hybrid or electric? You have your criteria, you weight them, and then you have an answer. It's pretty objective. It sounds simple, and yet the number of companies, especially in mid-level positions, that just bypass this. They have a hard time making decisions. This decision matrix can help. The second category is a diagnostic. Why? It's a root cause kind of thing. Costs are up in one area. There's a problem in one department. You have this driver tree, and you start just deconstructing. If it's a distribution center, for example, maybe you look at labor, you look at the truck costs, you look at the rent, you look at fuel, and eventually you see something that doesn't look right, and then you can go deep. The problem is, of the 100 things you could look at, you only have time to look at a few. And that's the good news, bad news about all this data and analytics that we're doing. You can run all kinds of slices, but those ones that you look at that you like so much, somebody did 30, 40, 100 versions and slices of data before that emerged. You simply don't have time for that. So you go through something like this, and then you can spend your precious time going deep on others. The third area is an argument. It's a hypothesis-driven what? Do you buy a company? Do you decide to do this thing? You state that you intend to do it, and you support it with some criteria. And then you prove or disprove. As you might imagine, it gets harder as you go across. These three are the bulk of what consultants do, bulk of what strategy firms do, and to have skills that no matter what's coming in the future, these three tools will really help. Frameworks are good on their own. They're really cool when you can use them and adopt them for your own purpose. I use this example because I had learned integration, area under a curve. I was explaining it to my brother who hadn't exposed to it yet. There was a tennis racket at the house. I love tennis. And I just showed him the area between the strings. And if you start to reduce it, it becomes infinitesimal and more or less the analogy for integration. He didn't get the details, but he got the concept. That's just one example of using a model, using a framework for your own benefit. All right. The other thing that's very helpful to learn and to organize and understand what you're doing is estimation. That is a semi-trailer. And you might say, okay, well, this is a ping pong ball. How many of these fit in the back of one of those? It's not an easy question when you first look at it. And yet, in the next 90 seconds, I can walk you through how you can get pretty close to an answer with no calculator, maybe your pencil. First of all, you just deconstruct what the problem is. How big is the volume? Then, what's the volume of the ping pong ball? And just divide. Simple, right? Well, how long is a semi-trailer? Well, it's about 4 cars, let's say. They're about 10 feet each. So 40 feet long. About how high is it? Let's say it's a basketball goal. That's 10 feet. Let's go back. 10 feet. And about how wide? Well, let's say a car is about 8 feet. So maybe 10 feet just around it. Great. So 40 times 10 times 10, 4,000 cubic feet. Now let's look at this ping pong ball. It's more than an inch across, maybe an inch and a half. Let's cut it in half, say 0.75. So 0.75. What's the volume on this? Well, pi r squared we all know is a circle, and maybe it's volume, so maybe it's pi r cubed, which is wrong. It's oversimplified. But if you did that and said 3 is pi and less than 1 cubed is a little less than 1, so it's 2. You multiply it out, and then you look at converting the cubic feet to cubic inches. Well, 12 times 12 times 12, which is over 1,700, but we'll just round it to 2,000, okay? Well, 4,000 times 2,000, 4,000 cubic feet times 2,000 cubic inches per foot, and you get 8 million. So 8 million, you divide by the volume, and it's 4 million. How close are we? Well, in some cases, like the trailer, we're off. In fact, we're off on most things. But we're kind of bouncing around there. And you know what? We're 31% off. Now, that might not be close enough if you had a hardcore report and a formal deliverable. But if you're looking at many observations a day, and you can get to within 20, 30% very quickly on something that's completely abstract to start, that allows you to focus. This estimation skill is something that can be learned. My daughters cringe now because we'll go into a place like this and how many chairs are there? How many lights? It's an interesting exercise that you can get pretty good at. And especially when you're in meetings with others, by tuning into this type of skill, you will run, if not circles around them, you'll certainly run ahead of them because you can kind of get what makes sense. And you can start to get the big picture before you dive deep. Looking at creativity, traditional brainstorming, people jump up, do the Post-it pads, you ideate, you develop, you test. It's more of a linear concept. I was fortunate several years ago to go to the D School at Stanford, work with the folks at IDEO, and take design thinking as a concept into our company. So more than 100,000 people later, 100,000 trainees later. It's not a brand new concept. Many companies have adopted it, but it's important to note it differs from traditional problem solving because instead of problem solving, you're problem finding. First of all, you understand. You take empathy. You think about the user, the customer. And then you go observe. We call them ethno-safaris, where you go to that retail environment. You look over the shoulder. You get that knowledge of someone. You look at the journey maps. And then you define. You have this broad problem space, and then you narrow it to the true one or two problems. Then you go into ideation. Then you look and you widen the solution space with all these possibilities. You prototype, not just once, but early low-fidelity prototypes. You get information back and you test. That's the essence of a design sprint. And I know that it's probably not new to many people in this room, but it still is something that, especially teaching people when they're younger, coming out of school, not to go in a linear mode. This is a picture of our corporate university in Mysore, India. It's the largest corporate university in the planet. 300 acres. We can train 20,000 people at a given time. The thing I'm most proud of is if a brand new technology or concept comes out, within 90 days we can have defined it, organized faculty, and begun teaching. So no matter what comes over the horizon, in the 90 days we can be ready and teaching our people how to deal with it. I mention that because that kind of rapid learning and that expectation is something you should have for yourself and your company. We also now, I'm proud to say, are building the largest U.S. corporate training university in Indianapolis, Indiana, and that will be ready next summer. So we'll be able to do the same thing on an aggressive basis here. And what's it mean for you? Digital platforms can take the power of what we just talked about and bring it to you. Be anytime, anywhere, and always on. Last fall, our chairman of the board said, we have this great corporate university, but we need to put this in where people are. The salesperson in the field an hour before their sales call. The project team member. The person who's just starting. We wanted to make it so it's convenient, relevant, fun, as well as high impact. Within 4 months, we had 60,000 people on this, spending 40 minutes a day. Everything that we do, we pump through here. And I bring this up. And by the way, LEX stands for Learning to the Exponential, LEX, that your company probably has something like this. And if they do, take full advantage of it. If they don't, go to Udacity, go to Code.org, go to these platforms. They can help you. We've partnered with some of them. We have good relationships, Code.org, for example. The main thing is you have much more power than you probably realize for anything that you want to learn. That's the corporate level. What's really fulfilling about this is when you take it to the next level, kind of planetary level. The United Nations a few years ago came up with 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and they literally cover everything from world hunger, poverty, climate change. For today's purposes, I wanted to highlight number 4, SDG number 4, quality education. These skills and concepts are relevant, not just for you or your company, but for the planet. I was at the United Nations 3 weeks ago on a panel for the International Day of Women and Girls in Science. And it's amazing, these skills we're sharing, we're helping young female farmers in Africa, women business people in Tajikistan. And it's changing the economic calculus there. They're having more of a voice, and it's also improving progress towards these goals. And I'd also submit that number 4 influences the rest of them. So if you aren't well-versed in these 17, take some time, because your companies and certainly countries and the UN are all organizing around these things going forward. So today we covered how these skills can affect you at a personal level, how at a company level with learning, and also at the planet level. Thank you very much. If you have further interest, these are some places to find me. But also, if anyone's interested in the presentation, I'm happy to share it. So however, South by Southwest makes this available. We do have time for questions if anybody has a question. Up in the front here. They're bringing the mic to you. Right here.
Can you tell about some of the books which someone can read on these topics?
Sure. One of them, and I was going to mention this to you, is one that I wrote called Consulting Essentials. We're doing a book signing here shortly afterwards. The Pyramid Principle is a good book. It's a bit of a long read. I think that you can get 90% of it from what I had in my book and some others, but that's a good book. Nancy Duarte has done some fantastic work on presentations, like Resonance. I think Peter Drucker's Effective Executive. It's a bit dated. It's solid. I think that reading Warren Buffett's shareholder letters is always good because it kind of kicks you up from the technical analysis. And as far as learning, I think anything that code.org puts out on general learning is also very good. The big thing is whatever your passion is right now or interest, go deeper in that. The intent for my book, like I said, was to provide an introduction to all these areas. And I have probably 30 or 40 references. Like, for example, on leadership. Servant leadership is part of it. And David Marquette, who has turned the ship around and kind of the father of servant leadership. There's a whole section on him, and you can go. Joseph Campbell, Hero's Journey, if you want to learn about storytelling and the 8 archetypes. There's so many of these that are fascinating, and I think it's a good place to start. Great, well, thank you very much. And if you would like, we got a book signing. Thank you.